Yeah, we're on.
Oh shit! No.
No, this is all going in. You're aware.
I wasn't even aware that we were starting. Welcome back to another episode of the Hippogryph podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the 4th edition Eberron campaign, Seekers of the Ashen Crown.
Oh, listen, we're not really talking about the Seekers of the Ashen Crown. We're talking about how to make better politics.
Yes, using Seekers
as a template.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, so we're talking politics today in your D&D campaign.
Yeah.
Just go watch Matt Colville's videos.
Just click away from this shit.
So if you're looking for... Okay, well, politics, I guess, is something that a lot of us think about in terms of fantasy fiction. Most recently because of Game of Thrones and its popularity.
And don't forget the complex politics of the Wheel of Time. And the upcoming Lord of the Rings Rings of Power TV show.
Which we were both looking incredibly forward to as devout fans of this. But as we know, fantasy fiction is full of nations and kingdoms. And chances are, if you're playing D&D in the more standard ways, your game probably takes place in a kingdom or nation as well. So despite this, most people really never interact with the higher levels of a kingdom. Because usually a kingdom is just a mere setting happenstance, right? We just happen to be set in the kingdom of Kaiman. Shout out to a filthy lot. Yeah. You know, there's no Kaiman, no diamond. You know what I'm saying? But it tends to be just something that's in the background that your players will never interact with. However, it should be noted that politics are always going to be part of any type of setting because D&D will typically involve countries, city-states, kings, people who are running...
Shakers and movers.
Yeah, shakers and movers who are running a political landscape. Because, of course, D&D is always going to be a reflection of us as individuals, as people, as societies, as a species, how we interact with. So politics always come into it. Whether or not you include it in your game, of course, is entirely up to you. But this podcast is for helping those of you who want to take your players from just going into dungeons, just kind of dealing with the average tavern keeps and highwaymen and road guards, and actually getting into some real interactions on a high level between big powers in your world. And for that, we're going to be using, like we always do, an adventure to kind of look through as a lens to determine what are some good templates in which you can use to begin establishing and creating a political landscape for your players to navigate. So in Seekers of the Ashen Crown, for those of you who don't know, it's a 4th edition adventure published by Wizards of the Coast some years ago, like 2008. And it was one of the big adventures to take place in the Eberron setting. Now, for those people who don't know the Eberron setting, Eberron is an entirely different setting than Forgotten Realms, and one that is, I feel, inherently more political. Now, when people talk about politics, I would also say right off the bat, make sure you pick a setting, or if you're making your own setting, make a setting that helps to facilitate politics. Forgotten Realms is wonderful for a lot of things, and I think even Ed Greenwood would admit that politics is not one of them, because Ed Greenwood stated many times when he was making Forgotten Realms, I mean, maybe you can correct me in the comments if you don't know if I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I am right about this, that he never really cared about nations and the placements of them and the interactions and the kind of the politicking stuff. He cared more about creating a world that was just rife for adventuring in terms of like dungeon delving, which is why when people think of Faerun and they think of the Forgotten Realms, they're much more likely to bring up things like Undermountain or Drizzt, or the various cities that are there, such as Neverwinter, Waterdeep, Baldur's Gate, and they don't really have much to say about many of the nations. Like, how many people who like Forgotten Realms really know where Cormyr is, let alone what it is? And that's because it's no shade on Forgotten Realms as a setting. It's just Forgotten Realms as a setting was not designed to facilitate politics. It was designed to facilitate adventure. Now, this is not to say that this is not to say that Forgotten Realms cannot have politics. I mean, certainly you can have something like Waterdeep Dragon Heist, where you have some internal factional politics and things like that going on within a city. It's not to say that you can't have that, but we're talking about geopolitics. We're talking about kingdoms fighting each other. We're talking about noble houses fighting each other.
Nation states.
We're talking about Game of Thrones type stuff. We're talking about Gondor, Rohan, these types of things. And when you deal with those types of things, it helps to have a setting that will facilitate the type of play that you want. So a big part of Eberron is its setting in terms of the main inciting incident for most of its nations in Corvair, which is the main continent, which is where the main story takes place, which is the Last War. So in the Last War, it's this huge World War I style event that shattered the old kingdom of Gallifreyan or whatever. That led to the creation of all the new kingdoms. And so a lot of them draw their inspiration from that and a lot of their conflict from that over, for example, who's the rightful successor to this old kingdom. So immediately you have all these kingdoms who had been through a huge war, which impacted the setting. One of the kingdoms was completely destroyed. And now you have all these kind of built-in conflicts for these kingdoms looking to one-up each other in kind of an interwar period. So this is very much a setting that is trying to capture that feel of the timeline between World War I and World War II. They're already past the first big conflict. Everyone can see a second big conflict on the horizon, and so they're just trying to think about how to position themselves best so that when the second conflict does arise, their nation can be better positioned than enemy nations. So right off the bat, this is a perfect political campaign setting because, one, it facilitates multiple nations with clear personalities, goals, histories, interests, and that's something that you really want to establish right off the bat, is thinking about how does this world, in essence, become alive to my players? And a big part of that is giving or making each of your nations, your kingdoms, kind of like their own character or their own kind of personality. For example, you can look over World War I in our recent history as something that would be looked at as a politically complicated war situation. And you can look at each of the main players in it, and they each clearly have their own identity, culture, history that people can kind of point to very easily. We know what Germany is like. We know what France is like. We know what Italy is like, or Britain, or Russia, and all the associated stereotypes and kind of the feel of the nation. And each of them kind of become a character on their own, especially if you look at those old political maps of World War I that were drawn to anthropomorphize each of the nations. Russia's like a giant bear, and England's like a regal lion, and France is like a giant elephant, and all these types of things.
You're talking about Leviathan?
But Leviathan took that from the older tradition.
Oh, really?
There was actual maps produced of that.
Oh, that's cool.
Leviathan was just trying to, I guess, emulate that.
Mm-hmm.
In the nation of, in the context of Darwinists and clankers, and actually even too, it's good that you mentioned Darwinists and clankers. You can set up nations along these giant kind of ideological lines. In the book Leviathan, it's a steampunk novel set in an alternate style World War I, where half the nations of Europe have adopted Darwinist principles in which they genetically mutate animals to become beasts of war and fulfill their military roles, and then the clankers use steam-powered machinery. And the nations of World War I have kind of drawn themselves along these ideological lines. So when you think about your nations, you want to think both about how you can give them unique characteristics. One of the easiest ways to do that a lot of people tend to do with is just associate them with an animal. Game of Thrones is very commonly known. Game of Thrones is very famous for doing this because each great house has a specific animal or a recognizable symbol associated with it. House Stark with the direwolves, House Lannister with the lions, House Baratheon with the stag, House Greyjoy with the kraken, and so on and so forth. So when you're going about making your nations, A, you want to have a few of them. B, you want to make sure there is some kind of central tension going on that sets up the campaign setting. So if you're doing something like Leviathan, where it's ideological, think about what those ideologies might be. You can even think about something like the Cold War. You can think of these two big superpowers based upon different ideas of, economics. But in a D&D world, for example, you could do something very clearly off maybe half the world does not think that magic is natural and wants to snuff it out, and half the world engages in magic. And so you have these worlds, or have this world in which half these nations are involved using like mage hunters and anti-magic and magic nullification, and the other half of the world is very much leaning into the magical warfare aspect and the inherent conflict and cultural differences that will lead to that. So it's very easy to just create a bunch of nations off one ideological conflict, because again, you don't need to create a whole separate world or anything. You just need something interesting for these nations to do and interact with each other, like they would if they were their own characters on a grand kind of stage or something. And Seekers of the Ashen Crown does that because it posits, like we said earlier, this war that left kind of a succession crisis and who can claim to be the true kingdom of Galifar and control over Corvair, and the different ways the nations will engage in various diplomatic and foreign relations to, like I said, jockey for position to better position themselves for a coming conflict. And in Seekers, one of the ways they do that is looking for the titular Ashen Crown, which is this ancient artifact. I can't think it was from the Hobgoblin Empire or something.
Well, it was first it was like the elves brought it, or the elves made it, and then the goblins took it, and yeah, it was the ancient Goblin Empire. Yeah, and they split it into like, because in
Eberron goblins are used to be civilized.
I was actually surprised about that, and I'm like, goblins, like. They're not like, disgusting little freaks that everyone just doesn't like.
Yeah, that was one of the weird things about Eberron is how they did goblins, I would say.
But anyway, the goblins took it, then they added a fifth piece to it, and it was like their artifact. Yeah. They sort of like took it from the elves. That was the trick. But then, what's his face? And then like a splinter, some like Goblin clan, the Keshwalar, they found a piece of it, and they want to basically find it and reclaim it. Yeah, and so they can like basically be the new, have a claim to the old Goblin Empire or whatever it was. And Breland in the adventure wants to help them, but like kind of secretly. Yeah, because they don't want to be seen helping the goblins, because that would be bad. Because other goblins would also. Like, yo,
and why did Breland want to help them again?
Because I think the Keshwalar were like, they were like the moderate goblins. Yeah, they were open to like negotiations.
This is a very U.S. State Department.
Yeah. They're open to negotiations. They were open to trade and other deals with the other, I guess, other races, empires, whatever. Yeah. So that's why they wanted to help. Yeah, that's the Ashen Crown. I did not read the whole thing. Yeah. But at least that's the vibe I was getting, I guess. Yeah. And then there's there's an elven necromancer named Demise, who kind of wants it just for herself.
I remember her.
Because she wants, because the crown has powers over, on death and, history or some shit. Yeah. And she wants it because she's an evil fucking necromancer. Who autistically wears a helmet everywhere.
You can't say that.
No, but she walks the first time you meet her. You're supposed to be meeting her in a normal circumstance. She's pretending to be some elven historian or dignitary, and she still wears it.
Listen,
it's okay.
You don't know how elves in Eberron act. Maybe it's normal for elves to wear that.
That's not even I was imagining me playing that campaign, for example, going through that adventure, and I'd be like. There's this woman with a weird headdress, and her apprentice is a weird, withered husk of a man. And I'm like, yes, these are definitely not evil guys.
Honey, it's time to look for the Ashen Crown again. Okay.
Yes, mistress.
But, yeah. Well, I mean, there's a pretty good political setup right off the bat. One, why can't Breland make it known that it's looking for the Ashen Crown? Because I guess other nations like Corvath and
Breland they have no interest in Ashen Crown. Yeah, because it's a holy goblin artifact. Yeah, and other goblins would like to have it because it gives them the claim for the old Goblin Empire. They just want to help the other goblins get it, or rather, the good goblins get it.
But they couldn't be seen officially helping.
Yeah. Because then, the other asshole goblins and other various political...
Yeah, because I thought it was both goblins and also other nations that they didn't want to be seen.
Yeah.
Because, Corvath, because, they have beef with Corvath, they have beef with, what's the other nation? Tharn, I think it is.
I don't know. I'm honestly not up to date with the Eberron lore.
Yeah, so, okay, here's a good point, right? So, there's a fraught political landscape in Eberron following the last war. So, it means that when the kingdom approaches wanting to do something, that's a good way to get your PCs involved, because your PCs essentially become like operators. Yeah. Because the kingdom wants to do something, get something done, but it can't be seen doing it publicly because of various political reasons. And one of those political reasons, one could be not being seen overtly helping a group of goblins.
Yeah, and they will be disavowed. The operator, or rather the guy who gives you the mission is we will deny any relation to you if you want to expose and try to expose this.
Very Mission Impossible. Yeah. So something like that is perfect. So when you have an issue where kingdoms cannot, I guess, what's the word? openly do things for fear of reprisal because there is a tense thing. Because in Eberron, there's always the fear of another war breaking out. But so there's something that's interesting in terms of how to get your PCs involved in the politics would be to just have your kingdom want something done. And you can literally add this or attach this onto any kind of campaign that you're doing or any kind of campaign idea you have. So if you have some type of artifact or something that you already had, or even existing campaigns that were both either published or that you were thinking of. Because a lot of campaigns revolve around finding particular artifacts or finding a particular person. So if you're trying to find a particular person, let's say you're trying to rescue this princess, which is a very common trope in D&D, why are you trying to rescue that princess? And two, why is she far away? Why is she not in her castle? Why is she not surrounded by her bodyguards? Did something happen? Did she get kidnapped? Did she get kidnapped by an enemy nation, perhaps? Did that enemy nation want to make it look like it wasn't trying to kidnap her? And already you can see you have the beginnings of a political game being birthed right off the bat. And it's very easy to work it in. So I think people get very overwhelmed when they think about politics because they think they must weave some epic Game of Thrones style conflict in order to get involved with politics. All politics really is various actors with power interacting with each other. And all you have to do to include that in your game is really just connect it to one or two nations that have a vested interest. And again, when we say nations, it doesn't have to be nations. It could be noble houses within the same nation.
Guilds.
It could be guilds, such as I know people like Ravnica, City of Guilds, a lot. And in that, of course, you have these different guilds for all fighting for political power.
To explain to our audience, the company cat Mangus keeps trying to jump onto the recording table. And I'm having to run the fucking interference here.
He just looks so upset when he does it slow. It looks like you physically hurt him by denying it. So, as long as it's just some sort of institution or group with power, again, it could be gangs, it could be noble families, it could be nations, could be noble houses, it could be anything that has a vested interest in what the players are after, because the players are always doing something. Because even if you think about the players getting involved in low-level campaigns, so you can think of something like Lost Mines of Phandelver, when you're just on your way to Phandalin to meet Gundren Rockseeker, right, and to look for some ancient artifact. Instantly, so easy to turn into a political campaign where you can just say, Gundren Rockseeker is actually working for the government. He's working for Waterdeep's government, or he's working for, I know Waterdeep's closest to Phandalin, but he's working for Baldur's Gate's government, or he's working for Neverwinter's government. And this in some way could actually work very well if you have players who are more familiar with a particular campaign world. If players are doing it in your campaign world, and they've never really interacted with it before, it might be a little difficult for them when they kill some guard, and they find out that he's got the unicorn patch of Bellamore, and you're looking at it like, oh, this big fucking, oh, and your players look at you blinking at like, what's the significance? Yeah. And in your mind, you know that on your campaign map, Bellamore is on the other side of the ocean. And so for an agent of Bellamore to be actively operating here, undercover, hiding his badge, is a huge fucking deal. But your players probably never looked at your campaign map. They probably didn't even open your PDF that you sent to them. So in some ways, it can be very useful to use pre-established campaign settings, such as Forgotten Realms, because most people kind of know where Neverwinter is, and most people kind of know where Waterdeep is, and most people kind of know where Baldur's Gate is. So if you find some guy who's like a guard of Neverwinter operating all the way down south in Baldur's Gate, I feel it's you'd be fairly confident that a lot of people at your table, if you're in Adventurers League or something even, would be kind of like, oh, that's a little odd to see something like that. And that's kind of the basis what you want to start off, because I would actually posit to most people that Game of Thrones is actually not a very good model to introduce people to political campaigns. I would actually focus more on things like James Bond and spy novels like Mission Impossible for getting people involved into government conspiracies. Because most political games involve some sort of conspiracy, right? Even Game of Thrones involves a conspiracy. Now, the reason Game of Thrones works is because Game of Thrones has the ability, as a novel, from several POVs, to show you like 20 different characters. Chances are, if you're really lucky, you have a party of 4 people, it doesn't really work. You're going to have to really follow this one group of characters, and the best way to do that is to do something like Mission Impossible. Mission Impossible focuses on a party of characters: Ethan Hunt, Benji, some
Paul Patton.
Yes, Paul Patton. A couple of girls who are interchangeable. So it's much more akin to a party situation than Game of Thrones is, I find. And it's a way that is much more political than something like Lord of the Rings, because Lord of the Rings isn't super political. It never really gets into the different kind of interactions between nations. I know you have like the Gondorian Civil War, and there's a civil war in Rohan, I'm pretty sure. Civil War in Arnor, but those really aren't the focuses of the narratives and what most people tend to draw away from. And if you're playing Adventures in Middle-earth or anything equivalent like the One Ring RPG, that's not really the focus of those. The focus of those is adventure and the eternal battle between good and evil. And that thing's all great, but in terms of if you want to have something political, it's much more easier.
It is much more easier.
It's much more easier. It's much easiest to use modern political espionage for inspiration. Cold War stuff, Man from U.N.C.L.E., Mission Impossible, James Bond, because I think that's much more akin to what your players will be doing. And it's very easy if you think about it. Take the most recent James Bond movie, Spectre, right? You have this group of scientists who were working on this...
Technically, it's No Time to Die.
No Time to Die. Thank you. Yeah, No Time to Die. They're working on this secret...
Hercules.
Heracles. And it was like nanotech that could kill people. So this secret weapon. And turns out that the British government's actually the one who funded it. But then this other group led by this other guy named Satin came in and kind of infiltrated the government's operation and then stole that to use it for their own purposes. And already I think you can see it's fairly easy. You turn the scientists into mages or into alchemists. You turn the secret government lab into some type of underground alchemist laboratory that they were working on. You turn the British government into whatever kingdom you happen to be in, right? You turn Satin, the weird billionaire... Safin. You turn Safin... what was it? Lucifer, Safin, yeah. You turn him into some evil necromancer.
You turn him into a demon or a
devil. A necromancer, a lich. You turn Heracles into...
the spell plague curse.
I was about to say, the spell plague curse. You could turn it into the soul fucking monger from Tomb of Annihilation. And then something the kingdom was working on. And if you set it somewhere like Eberron or something, and these kingdoms are preparing for war, this kingdom tried to use ancient knowledge, ancient arcane secrets to create some type of weapon that would give them an edge in the war. Turns out that their operation of alchemists was infiltrated by a necromancer or a devil who wanted to cause chaos for his own purposes. And already you have this incredibly complicated weaving network of different power players. The kingdom, the devil... Necromancer, you can work in the Necromancers Guild, you can work in other nations that have interest in it, because again, in James Bond, who's one of James Bond's best friends, Felix from the CIA, you easily can change him as an NPC into a guy from a neighboring kingdom who has interest in making sure that this kingdom to the north of them, that borders them, does not have this magical bomb that's about to go off, right? So I would say that it's much easier to turn modern sci-fi espionage stuff into D&D campaigns for political purposes than it is to kind of...
To simulate Game of Thrones.
Because you're not going to be able to simulate Game of Thrones unless you have a lot of people in different groups. And that's really difficult for most people to pull off. And you're going to have that consistent, ongoing interaction weaving. It's very difficult to do.
That's actually a good point, because, like, in my experience, I was sort of, like, trying to do some things with my, like, Windsor group. I was trying to, like... Game of Thrones was really, really popular back then. So I was like trying to do some like political thingies, which didn't work really, but made me think that generally the difficulty of running like a compelling political campaign or having any sorts of like big reveals in a tabletop RPG setting is because inherently in tabletop RPGs your players are both actors or like characters in the story, but also they are also the viewers of an adventure. And as such, the sort of the standard fiction thing of like, for example, in like books or movies, right? Where it's like the viewers, like the good thing to do is to have like the viewers find something out just before the player, rather the characters.
Yeah.
And then so, the viewers get a nice like, oh shit, or rather like the viewers, they know something that the characters don't, and so they watch them do some. They watch the characters do something, and you as a viewer, you're like, oh, I know what's happening here. And
don't go in there.
Don't go in there. This is an axe murderer, but like in a political sense. Yeah. You can't really do that at all in tabletop RPGs. Like no matter what people say about like, oh, I don't metagame, you know?
It's impossible to separate.
Yeah. People are going to inherently metagame to some extent.
Yeah.
And so, as a DM, if you try to do that, you either run the risk of like either showing your hand and exposing literally every like aspect of your little plot or whatever, and your players are like, okay, look, he's evil, we go kill him, or like, oh, it's an evil artifact, okay, we just don't touch it. Or on the opposite, on the other side, completely blindsiding the PCs and being like, fucking haha, you've been betrayed this entire time. Your quest giver was an evil asshole. Yeah. And the players are like, oh, okay. Oh, thanks, I guess. I don't want to play this game anymore. And, you know, there you just, you know, you feel like a retard. Which I kind of did because, you know, when I play, I blindsided my players and they like, and one of the characters that was executed for being an evil like werewolf demon, not demon worshipping, but like devil pact making person, and I completely killed that character. I kind of regret it in retrospect. And granted, the character was a little cringe, being like a half werewolf, like a thingamajig.
It had to die,
but like, I think it was part of the reason why that campaign died. Which, you know, you live and you learn.
Well, that's the point of this podcast. To help people not make the same mistakes.
And again, it's also further complicated by, again, what kind of players you have. I think we talked about this before. Yeah. Where, like, if your players are fairly standardly, like, passive, where they just follow you along, and they might, you know, they follow your hooks, but you have to, like, sort of very explicitly dangle them in front of your players. You're gonna have one experience. If your players are more active and they're like, you know, more invested and they're actually of their own accord, they're willing to go and chase down leads.
Well, see, I'd say
talk to people.
That's one of the big differences, I'd say, between like something like Game of Thrones and something like let's say James Bond or Mission Impossible or even something like Die Hard. Is another reason why I think they would work a lot better is because they tend to have reactionary protagonists. Yeah. And if you look at all the protagonists in Game of Thrones, someone like Eddard Stark, right? His whole political machination was started by him. Going out looking for leads. And like, do you think that your players are going to be out there chasing down leads on old books of the guy who died, looking to put together to see if the kid is actually a bastard or not, right? Chances are, you know, you're right. Your player's not going to want to do that, right? But that being said, if they stumble on something they shouldn't have, and this evil necromancer / billionaire social media mogul, whatever it was from James Bond, tries to kill you, right? Already, like, why is this person trying to kill me is one of the central things for most of these types of espionage movies. Yeah. Right? Mission Impossible, right? Like, in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, the very first beginning of his interactions with, what's the guy's name? Solomon Lane, right? Solomon Lane did something to him. He didn't do anything to Solomon Lane, right? He walked into the record store, and Solomon Lane, what did he do? He put him in that box, right? So imagine doing that to your players, right? Imagine killing an NPC in front of your players while they're helpless to do so, right? Yeah. Something like that.
That's a classic.
That is a classic, and that would get your players invested, but that's a reaction that they would have to you doing something to them, right? Yeah. And I feel that because a lot of Hollywood scripts tend to have reactionary protagonists, because it's a little bit easier to write, that it works very well for your protagonists in your own game as players, because typically they're going to be more likely to react to something than search for something on their own. Yeah. They're going to be more reacted to react to a bad guy or react to some kind of magical equipment, because like they might see some like deadly magical bomb that they walk into and like, okay, I'm not going to touch it, but like, are we just going to leave it here? Yeah. Are we just going to tell no one about it? Like, something's been done, right? And if they've seen it in action, let's say, right? Yeah. It's like, well, what do we do, right? Like, you present the question to your players. What do you do with this? What do you do after he did that to you? And you let your players answer it, and then you present them with another question. And I think that question and answer thing is what makes those kinds of Sherlock Holmesy, James Bond, Mission Impossible things so much easier to work with as a DM when you're crafting adventures for your players than something like a grand political narrative that we might think of in terms of Game of Thrones, or like when you I don't know, Mark Antony or something, right? When it's like, how do I have this big, expansive? It's like, typically D&D is only involving a few people, and so something that's going to be big and expansive just kind of out of the purview. If you want something big and expansive, like go play Diplomacy, which, by the way, is something you can play in the background of your D&D games, which I thought was very interesting by Matt Colville.
That would be kind of interesting, yeah.
Yeah, he had a very good idea where he's like, I think Capital, in his game, he based Capital's map off the map of Diplomacy, right?
Isn't the map of Diplomacy basically just, like, the world map?
Well, it's Europe, right? But if you actually break it down, all you need is for the certain supply center zones to touch the... As long as the provinces line up, you can actually make it whatever shape you want.
Right, okay.
I did it once, and I tried running it for one game. I will never do that again, because that was a fucking bitch to make. To, like, make sure everything connects and still have it... Anyway, you can do that if you want. Maybe I'll find that and I'll post a PDF if you want to use it. Because it's like a generic fantasy land.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like Europe, but all the points still line up, so you can still technically play Diplomacy.
So as long as the template still fits.
Yeah. And so that was something, if you really want that like Game of Thronesian type feel, you could have your players or people that you like who like war games play like a war game in the background that is influencing the world that your players are actually adventuring in.
Yeah.
But in terms of actual like the scale of D&D, D&D is a heroic scale. It's not a grand strategy scale. So I think the reason why people think political games are so hard to run and why I think so many people have problems with them is because they think Game of Thrones when they think of political, when they should be thinking James Bond. That's or Mission Impossible, because that's so much easier to run, and you still get the whole intrigue spy thing because your players are basically going to be operating as medieval spies. Yeah, right. If they're involved in something like that, right?
And obviously, it helps if your players have a modicum of investment in their own characters or backstories. So there's a reason for them to, I don't know. For example, maybe their quest giver is like the fighter's old captain. Or like the the noble wizard has like a brother or like a cousin who needs a favor or something. Obviously, I know I'm telling like really groundbreaking stuff here, but having invested players does mean your political campaign will be better. Yeah, well, listen,
we can't account for any person listening to this to have invested players. It's a question of like, even if your players are uninvested, how would you get them to react? Yeah. Right? Because even if the player is not invested, I think you can always get a player to react.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? And enough reactions will push them in the way that you want them to go, right?
Building the investment.
Yeah. Barring a player who's just like, I don't want to be here.
Yeah. Who's on their phone.
Like that is for another episode. That is purely on player interest and how to talk to your group and how to not be autistic, quite frankly, and just be a human being. Yeah. Just be like, Jonathan, what the fuck? I thought we were here to play, and you're sitting there texting your girlfriend from Afghanistan, who you've never met. I know that sounds specific, but this never happened to either. We don't even know anyone named Jonathan. So, but I would say that barring players who are completely uninterested, having even players who are not comfortable with their characters, players who are varying levels of interest, I think the reactionary model is always the best way to go. Yeah. Because chasing players up a tree, as Matt Colville said a bunch of times, is a really good way to get them to do things. And I find that modern spy novels are very good at chasing their protagonists up trees. Like, Ian Fleming always found a new way to chase James Bond up a tree. Yeah. And then the whole adventure was seeing how James Bond would get down it, right? So that's really what you want to do with your characters. Same thing with Mission Impossible. And we all watch Mission Impossible. We all watch James Bond. We all know kind of generally how these plot structures go. If you're older, you might even remember the Cold War. If you're younger, you could even use current events. I mean, how many times have we watched movies like Zero Dark 30, or even just now came up Terminal List, right? And the Terminal List, I'm sure we can draw a lot of comparisons to Maisie Williams playing Arya Stark and her kill list in Game of Thrones. So you can do tons of these things where you can draw modern themes and modern ideas into the Middle Ages. It's not that hard, right? Not to say that you should do Game of Thrones, but it is to say that you can watch modern media that you enjoy, that's espionage-like, right? Even stuff that we know, like the war in Afghanistan, right? The CIA, stuff like that, right? Yeah. There's no reason why the CIA can't just be a secretive guild of mages in your world, right? Like you had the Academy in Lenoria, thank you. So there's no reason why you can't take these modern fixtures. And the great thing about taking modern fixtures, I find too, is that your players are going to be typically more familiar with them, and you have good language to explain to them. Because if you're like, okay, I have this secretive group of like mages, and they kind of like work with the king, but they don't, and your players are like, what the fuck is this? You just look at them and you just say, Wizard CIA. And most of your players will go, oh, okay, I get it, right?
There's also like Wizard FBI, and they don't know what the other's doing.
Well, you could say that the Paladins Order of the Gauntlet. Well, what are they? Well, they go around and they regulate magic. They're like, well, Paladin FBI.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wizard CIA. Oh, okay. Yeah. Right? And honestly, a lot of that stuff did function very... Like, there's always been intelligence services for kings and things like that, right? Whether or not we called them that, we've always had spies. We've always had saboteurs. We've always had tinkers, tailors. We've always had those types of people. Yeah. And those types of secretive organizations, right? So it's really easy, I find, to reflavor that stuff. So I wouldn't really worry so much about, like, the window dressing of these modern properties, and you're worried, oh, whatever. Instead, I would look at, it's very easy to dress up for the Middle Ages, which is D&D's standard setting. And on top of that, it's going to be employing a lot of common tropes that chances are your players are going to be familiar with. Yeah. And players like it when they see tropes and things that they understand. I mean, I clapped when I saw it is not just something that you say.
Yeah.
And I know we shit on it every once in a while on this podcast, but it's true. People like to see things they recognize.
Yeah.
And chances are, if your players are regular people, they've probably seen the latest James Bond, they've seen the latest Mission Impossible, they've seen all these types of things, and they would know the beats and the cues, and it would actually be easier for them to follow along, because if it's something new that they have no idea about, especially if they're new to D&D, what the fuck am I supposed to do? But if they're new to D&D, but they know all about the spy stuff, and you employ very common spy tropes, they'd be like, oh, it's like in James Bond. Oh, it's like in Mission Impossible. And that might actually help to bridge the gap and make D&D a little bit easier for them to get into. Kind of think about, like, oh, it's like Sherlock Holmes. Oh, it's like this. Oh, it's like that, right?
You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
No, you don't. You really don't. Especially in a political campaign, which is already going to be a little bit, like, it's a little bit more difficult to run than just the generic
a
dungeon
little more
delve.
high concept than just, like, go kill some goblins.
Yes. Just your standard dungeon delve is, I mean... A nutless monkey could run a standard dungeon delve. Computers can run dungeon delves, right?
Yeah.
You don't need a human being to run a dungeon delve. I mean, it's fun, but it's not necessary, right?
Yeah.
Most games that you run today that are RPGs, like Skyrim, are dungeon delves. That's what they are, right? A computer can run.
To be fair, Skyrim did try to do a political thing. It was like it was very
surface level.
And it wasn't very well worked out, but it was there.
It was there, but like the main meat and potatoes of Skyrim was the dungeon delving, and that could be run by a computer, right? You didn't need a human being to run it, right?
Yeah.
So this is to say that dungeon delves don't require a lot of skill to run at the base level. Obviously, Matt Mercer could run it so well at the moment he described. You walking in and you seeing the moss on the walls, and you're like, oh. I understand before people like get like all whatever. Yes, there's always varying levels of degrees, but at the base level, dungeon delves are less complicated than running political campaigns. So I'd go easy on yourself and easier on your players. Again, unless you have an experienced group of people. But this is primarily for people who don't know that much.
Yeah,
people who are new, people who want to get ideas, and I think basing it off of spy stuff is so much easier than basing it off of medieval politics or like World War One or this really grand scale stuff, because the great thing about spy stuff is that it connects to the high level stuff.
Yeah,
but it's not solely the exclusivity of that, right?
That's a good. Honestly, that's a good way to put it. Because don't do Game of Thrones.
No, it's a novel. It's great as a novel, but I think it's best kept a novel.
It's inherently different.
Yeah, the only way that could work is like if you were at a convention and you had like 4 different tables that are all swapping around of people, and it's like a murder mystery whodunit type thing, right?
Yeah.
Then it could work, right? And these people are from this house and that people from that. But chances are, if you're sitting down every Friday with a group of 4 guys or less, that's all you're really going to have time for. That's all you're going to have the capability to produce as an effective illusion in your game.
Yeah.
At least that I can see. And something like Seekers of the Ashen Crown is perfect, because Seekers of the Ashen Crown is basically a CIA game. Right? You're working for Breland undercover. You can't let people know, to help legitimize a group of goblins. That are
a group of terror goblins
that are amenable to Breland's foreign interests, right?
Yeah.
A la the Mujahideen, right? Except goblins, right? So, and you can draw stuff like that. Like you can, not to get too political, but you could take something like the Mujahideen, and you could just take the CIA and the United States government and the Soviet Union, and you turn the Soviet Union into, I don't know, the Kingdom of Kaiman.
Yeah.
And you take the USA and you turn them into the Kingdom of Dolomar, and you take the Mujahideen and their kingdom and you turn it into, I don't know, the Kingdom of Brekka. And the Mujahideen are a group of, I don't know, elves. Let's say elves.
Let's break the mold here.
Let's say elves, right? And they're a group of elves who are fighting to keep their forest. And
kind of actually reminds me of The Witcher. What's these? Those elves.
Oh yeah, the Scoia'tael.
Yeah.
The Scoia'tael are a perfect example. Who are waging a guerrilla campaign against the Northern Kingdoms, who are secretly funded by Nilfgaard to weaken. Right, and there's some perfect stuff that you can get involved in at the base level very easily.
But one thing I noticed with the Secrets of the Ashen Crown, they start throwing like weird names at you right away.
Yeah,
that's a bit of a like. It took me a little bit to like understand like.
Well, that's just having to understand Keith Baker's gobbledygook.
Yeah, it's like this elf empire, but then there's this goblin empire, and also weird different factions of goblins, but also this Breland's little secret service, basically. And I was like, hold on, what's going on?
Yeah, I would say like always. This should become like the golden rule of the channel, right?
Yeah.
KISS, keep it simple, stupid, right? Like D&D is complicated enough for most people that. Further complicating it is just going to lead to a session where like people are just like really tired after a long day of work and they're sitting there, they're just like, what was that king's name again?
Yeah.
What was the name of that other elf empire? Oh, you're talking about the Exclavashi.
Yeah.
Oh, was it that? Oh, no. You were talking about the Noshivani. Oh, they're a totally different group of people. And it's like people just...
And introduce stuff gradually.
Yeah. If you're like, and this is a separate thing, maybe a video episode we can do on naming.
Yeah.
Don't name shit that doesn't include English words. Wheel of Time has ruined a lot of people into thinking that fantasy names have to have apostrophes and non-English sounding things. Chances are, if you're listening to this, well, why would you be listening to this if you're a non-English speaker?
Yeah.
You're an English speaker, which means your players are probably English speakers, which means use English words for the most part, right? That's one thing Game of Thrones... if you want to take something from Game of Thrones, take that, right? Everything in Game of Thrones, for the most part, Pike, Winterfell, Casterly Rock, King's Landing, these are things that work and are memorable because we understand them in English, right? They're not easy to remember when they're in a foreign dialect, and unless you're the next Tolkien... who can create an aesthetic language like Elvish and name your things based off that. Because, sure, people might say Gondor and Rohan are not English names per se, but they're based off a linguistic guy.
Yeah.
He studied linguistics. What's the word for it? Philologist?
I think so.
Philologist, yeah. Yeah, a pro-philologist from Oxford who had an obsession with aesthetic languages that sounded nice and worked for decades of his life to make sure they sounded nice. That's the reason why Gondor sounds nice and whatever the fuck Robert Jordan came up with sounds stupid. Not to hate on Robert Jordan, I'm sure people like him, but whatever. Or liked him. Like Shinzo Abe, he has gone the way of the dodo bird.
We'll try to keep it current on this podcast.
We'll try to keep it current. I'm more upset about Kazuki, man.
Yeah.
Didn't need to go out like that. And the police haven't ruled out foul play.
Well, I mean, if he's floating in the sea, kind of sounds to me like foul play.
Yeah.
I feel like he didn't just fall off a barge.
They're going to shoot the Legend of Zelda guy in the head next.
Roll a suicide. First was the guy who wrote Berserk.
I know, right? First Miura has a heart attack.
Yeah.
Then Kazuki goes down. Then the Mario guy goes down. Then the Pokemon guy goes down.
Then finally Shinzo Abe fucking got shot. With the homemade gun.
Shinzo Abe got shot a day before Kazuki Takahashi washed up on the shores of Japan. Being eaten by goddamn seals. Or whatever the hell he was being eaten by, crabs.
Yeah. Something
is rotten in the state of Japan. That's how it be on this bitch of an earth. I think that's most of it, right?
Yeah.
I think so. I think it was a pretty comprehensive discussion. Mm-hmm. This is Hippogryph. I'm Hippo.
And
across from me is Griff.
Sure.
And we are signing off. We'll see you back for episode 8 where we discuss... 7, where we discuss a topic that will be
decided
on a future date. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. We hope that it has helped you, at least in some way, understand politics and how to run them better in your campaign, how to include them in your campaign. And we would love to hear, because we got so many comments on our last video, we would love to hear, because people always ask us.
Yeah.
All the people always, our DMs are flooded with people asking us to always shout them out in the comments. So if you have anything that's happened to you politically, I mean in D&D, interesting to happen in D&D politically, or you had a story or an idea or anything that happened in between, put it in the comments. We read all the comments. There's no comments, so we read them all. Gang signs.
Peace.
Peace out.